Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 48. I am the show's host, Kyle, and two announcements before I get into the news today. And the first is that please share the show. The show's growing. It's awesome. I'm loving it. But if everybody could just take a minute out of their time to share the show in some foreign policy group on Facebook or tweet it out or recommend it to a friend or family member or wherever you could get the show out there, I really appreciate it. Not only does sharing the show expose the show to your audience, but Facebook algorithms, it gets out there more to like my friends and family and groups and advertisements and stuff like that as well. So the more you're sharing the show, the more you're helping the show in numerous ways. For those of you who are sharing the show, thank you so much, and I just really appreciate it, and it's really making a difference. And the other announcement would be that Will Porter will be a guest on the show sometime next week. And we will be discussing the Syria issue. I'm hoping that we really get into the changing U.S. strategy there. And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on the Iraq-Syria border. And I think it's really important. And hopefully Will's going to give us some really good insight. So look forward to that coming next week. Hopefully Monday's show. I really do want to touch on Syria. And so I think we're going to mostly focus on it on Monday. And I'm not going to say too much about it today for that reason. The first bad news I want to talk about is not typical foreign policy news, and so I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail about it, but Trump did pull out of the international climate agreement, the Paris Climate Accord or treaty or whatever the hell the thing is. From my understanding, the agreement didn't require the United States to really do anything but to give away some money, and it really didn't require many countries to really make any commitments. It was just more everybody was in agreement to do what they can to cut down on fossil fuels, but if you don't do it, oh well, and if you do it, good for you. And so it doesn't seem like anything that's really going to make a difference to me. People in the international community are, the reason I bring this up mainly is because I've been seeing a lot of stories coming out, mainly left-wing sites, saying that this puts Trump in line with terrorist countries, and then refers to several countries in the Middle East saying like, oh my god, Trump is just like Syria, Trump is just like whatever, one of the Gulf countries or something like this because he's backing out of the Paris peace agreement. And I guess it bothers me a little bit, the complete unawareness of these people, to where Obama was really assisting these countries and they didn't say a word. Nobody ever voiced any opposition to Trump's support for Obama's support for Saudi Arabia. But now that it's Trump pulling out of the climate deal, they're trying to smear Trump for being an associate of Saudi Arabia and Syria for another reason. Also, all of these people who are so up in arms about global warming, I mean, look at one of the world's biggest polluters. How much, carbon and how much just negative waste and pollution is created, moving this massive military all over the world, all the nuclear bombs to produce them and then to maintain them and then test them and use them. How much has that been responsible for negative climate effects in the earth? And just look now, even with the missions the U.S. is flying, they're dropping thousands of bombs every month, and drones are hovering over Yemen 24 hours a day. How much does that contribute to the problems that we have going on here? Whenever everybody's talking about fossil fuels, they're always blaming the private industry, but look at the biggest polluter. It has been determined to be the Pentagon because, like I said, they're flying planes everywhere, they're sailing ships everywhere, there's submarines underground, they're testing nuclear weapons, they're producing testing missiles and rockets and all this kind of stuff, and they're setting off. I remember when you had the Bundy standoff going on and the U.S. government being so concerned about cows trampling on desert tortoises, but then at the same time nobody says anything about the U.S. indiscriminately dropping bombs all over Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And so it's just always seemed to be a very odd contradiction to me that the left wing is so willing to condemn all these climate and environmental issues, but then never says anything about one of the leading causes of pollution and certainly a leading killer. I mean, I guess whenever war is going on, nobody really considers the amount of animals that are killed in war because the humans are being killed. But in the botched U.S. raid in Yemen, you had over 100 goats being killed by the U.S. bullets and everything, by the firefight there. And so I guess just when you're talking about nature and humanity and the climate and the earth in general and how we treat it, nobody ever seems to be able to condemn condemn the military for this one. They're the worst of anybody. And yet we turn our attention and really condemn people who, I mean, like, no doubt, like, BP did a lot of damage with the oil spill, but nobody's ever said anything about the military and their damage to the environment. And so I think that the inability to criticize the military on this has always been kind of surprising for me, especially from the left wing. I mean, they just never do. Other news at the top I want to talk about is Trump not wanting to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel, or at least postponing the move. It sounds like there may be some kind of planned move that now they're just going to keep pushing it back. The move would really symbolize, I guess, the end to a two-state solution. I think it is largely seemed. I know the Palestinians still claim a lot of the Jerusalem area, and the U.S. deciding to put their embassy there would be a clear support for Israel having legal rights to the city, and I think would probably eliminate any Palestinian claim to the city. Not that the U.S. Embassy being in Jerusalem or not should have any impact on who really owns the city, but in the world where the mightiest force is the U.S. government, I guess whenever the U.S. government says something, it kind of goes. But Trump not moving the embassy to Jerusalem is a good move. I mean, I wish he wouldn't have even brought up the topic in the first place. I think it was a negative thing, but at least he's pushing back on it and not doing it, and so yeah, this is good. I think the embassy move would create a lot of conflict in Israel and Palestine. I also want to mention that 11 Americans were injured in the Taliban suicide bombing in Kabul. That's the capital of Afghanistan. On the last show, I mentioned that 80 people had died. The death toll has increased to over 90 now, and like I said, 11 Americans were injured, not seriously injured. The Americans were contractors. I think they were construction workers working on a project somewhere in Kabul. I want to take this as an opportunity to show just how vulnerable Americans are to terrorists, and how our continual involvement in these countries is going to continue to expose Americans to being killed by terrorists in wars we shouldn't be involved in. Americans needlessly dying. And luckily we didn't have any Americans die in this case, but that doesn't mean that next time those 11 injuries aren't going to turn into 11 deaths. One story out of Syria I did want to touch on, and this is about the aid situation in the Idlib province of Syria, and just overall just a discussion about the aid situation going into Syria, because I do touch on the aid situation in Yemen, but I really haven't in Syria. So one problem about the aid situation in Syria is that Turkey has really prevented the humanitarian organizations from going to either Kurdish or Syrian government supported regions through Turkey, and then they actually have to go through Iraq to get to these regions. In some cases, like the Afrin area in Syria, which is a kind of a Kurdish enclave pretty much further west than the other Turkish strongholds east of the Euphrates in Syria. And so this is already difficult, making the aid more difficult. And if you look at these aid organizations, often have pretty limited resources. So the harder it is to get aid to these areas, then the less amount of aid these organizations can supply. Also, just the longer the journey, the more dangerous the journey is for the aid workers. If you think about that these people are really walking into war zones to try to give money or to give money and food or whatever to starving people, I think if you make the more dangerous you make the path, the more likely that more and more aid workers are going to die. And certainly aid workers do die every year trying to provide aid in war zones. I mean, very brave people who give their lives for that. One of the interesting things is that, we just had Memorial Day, and certainly I don't want to criticize too much the concept of Memorial Day, but just to say that there isn't a day to honor the people who gave their lives not fighting the war, but trying to just help the average citizens get by in a war zone, the non-fighters, the people providing aid to the non-fighters. Anytime if a U.S. service member dies providing support and assistance to, let's say, Iraqi soldiers, then they will, receive the honors of Memorial Day and be honored by the American people. But if a doctor dies in a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Yemen when a bomb, either U.S. or Saudi made, hits that hospital, nobody will ever celebrate that life of the doctor who also gave his life serving in the war. I mean, yeah, he wasn't serving Assad. He wasn't serving one of the armies. He was serving the people. He was just serving humanity. He was saying, I am here to help whoever needs it and to try to make this awful thing that's going on a little bit less awful. Yeah, so I got a little off track there, but I do just want to point out that these aid workers are amazing people and doing really amazing work, and they're saving more lives every day than the interventions that the U.S. carries out ever could. And now, another situation we have going on in northwest Syria that's making aid difficult to get to civilians is that the jihadists have really taken over the Idlib province. I detailed in past episodes how most of the checkpoints in the major roads in the Idlib province are controlled by Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda linked groups. And so these aid workers are put in a situation where, one, they're dealing with more dangerous people like the jihadists or the crazy suicide bomber types. And I think that as an aid worker, I would feel more uncomfortable working with somebody who has affiliation with people who blow themselves up in crowds of civilians as a way to further my cause. You also have issues with there being a lot of international laws in place that prevent you from being able to work with groups who are on the terrorist list. And so let's say a lot of times I think there's situations where aid workers probably have to pay like cuts to the local ward or whatever, or, you know, he gets kind of first pick of food or however this nonsense ends up working. But you can't make that deal with the ISIS or the Al-Qaeda linked groups, and so that adds just another problem that the aid workers just simply can't get the aid there. And it is needed. There's 900,000 internally placed Syrians within the Idlib province and in northwest Syria, and it's a significant number of people who really need aid in a war-torn area. That's only going to get even worse because while the U.S. is doing nasty things in East Syria, you have the Syrian government and Russia doing nasty things in West Syria. And the bombing of the Idlib province isn't any better really than the U.S. bombing of Raqqa. Although, I guess right now the stats say that America is killing more people in Syria than Russia. Next, I got a few stories from Iraq I want to talk about. The first is that 31 people died in a suicide bombing in Baghdad. I'm not sure if I covered this story in Wednesday's show or not. I may have mentioned that 10 people died in a suicide bombing on Wednesday, but it was actually 31. It's at least being reported now that the suicide bomber targeted an ice cream stand where there may have been a Muslim girl breaking the Ramadan fast, I believe. I'm not sure if this is true or maybe just a coincidence, but if it is the case, I guess that does add to some amount the horrendousy of the crime of, driving a car into a group of people and then blowing yourself up in it. I have pointed this out on the show in the past, but I just want to make the point again that I think this is a trend of things to come, that you're going to see more suicide bombings around Syria and Iraq as ISIS loses their territory. This was certainly this is what happened after the fall of ISIS in Ramadi and Tikrit and Fallujah, that you had a lot more terrorist ISIS members attacking either Baghdad or Kirkuk and other areas. I believe Tikrit has suffered quite a few terrorist attacks since ISIS was kicked out of there. On the last show, I mentioned the breaking story about the elite Iraqi Special Forces unit being filmed murdering people and torturing people, and this reporter really blowing the whistle on this. As of right now, the U.S. continues to provide support to those forces. I have not been able to tell if the officers who were clearly guilty of war crimes were dismissed from their post or not, but even providing support to the unit still seems like the U.S. will pull away from supporting that unit. It does sound like the U.S. government is at least saying that there is some kind of review process taking path right now. However, this is what the U.S. did in Yemen after the funeral bombing that may have killed over 200 people, where a Saudi warplane bombed a Yemeni funeral hall where there's a whole bunch of people inside mourning the death of some important northern Yemeni. And so a lot of people were killed, and then the target was actually hit multiple times by airstrikes. It's really horrific footage. And so it may be a situation like what we had there in Yemen, where Obama said, oh yeah, we're investigating the Saudis for this, and then Saudi investigate themselves, and they said, oops, we made a mistake. And Obama said, well, maybe I won't give you some precision-guided munitions, but I'm still going to continue to support your war, including refueling your planes so you could go and hover over Yemeni cities longer. and bomb the civilians there for a longer amount of time. So I'm kind of guessing that's the report we're going to see here, is that where after about 6 months, the report finally comes out. It says, yeah, they did something wrong, but I promise they're fixing it, and we're just going to kind of keep doing what we're doing anyways, but maybe we're going to just do a little bit less for them. I've been reading reports out of Mosul that ISIS fighters are starting to close off streets and prepare to make a last stand at Grand Mosque in Mosul. This is a significant and historic landmark in the Arab world, and I wonder if it'll end up getting destroyed in the battle. It seems like this was maybe one thing that has kind of been destined to happen since Baghdadi gave the speech that declared the caliphate at this particular mosque. It seems that they're very much closing in on the mosque and are looking to take it. I guess the questions here are just going to be how many civilians are going to die in the battle. I think there is going to be some resistance to bomb the mosque itself, so they may try to bomb surrounding structures. And how many civilians are in those structures? How many civilians is ISIS going to force into the mosque to try to prevent U.S. airstrikes, or at least to provoke as much collateral damage as possible? So I guess this is kind of the calculation that American generals should be making right now. And that is, even if the ISIS fighters bar themselves in this mosque with thousands and thousands of civilians, and there's a lot of really bad ISIS fighters in there, and they say we're going to kill all these civilians before you kill us, or whatever. If the U.S. bombs and destroys the mosque, just imagine the blowback that would create of the U.S. destroying this historic Arab landmark, very important to the Muslim faith, with thousands of civilians inside. Of course, this would end up creating multitudes more terrorists than you would ever kill in the actual strike. But I think this is something that we should be fearing and be aware of, and just, I don't know what Americans could do right now to prevent the U.S. strategy in Mosul from doing whatever it wants, but just demanding some kind of pullback and restraint from the Trump government and what they're willing to do in Mosul to try to kill the ISIS fighters and their annihilation tactics that General Mattis said the U.S. government is now using is just so dangerous. At least 200 civilians have been killed, were killed on Tuesday alone in Mosul. The civilians died in a combination of airstrikes from the Iraqi government and from the U.S. and from the U.S. coalition. And so this is just another huge death count in a long string of huge death counts that have been coming out of Mosul and cities in Syria from U.S. bombs for a long time. Really since 9/11. But just looking at the fight against ISIS alone, this has been a very common trend. U.S. airstrikes killed 13, U.S. airstrikes killed 30, U.S. airstrikes killed 20, U.S. airstrikes killed 100. Then the numbers just pile up. I think over 700 civilians died in Iraq in May alone, so the numbers are just out of proportion. And now I want to talk about the difference in the media coverage between East Aleppo and the old city of Mosul. In East Aleppo, the media, especially the Western media, was extremely critical of the actions of the Syrian government and the Russian government, and largely rightly so. This was a portion of Aleppo, the remaining portion of Aleppo, that was really quarantined off from any other at that time Al-Qaeda stronghold. There were, I believe, tens of thousands of civilians in East Aleppo at the time that the besiegement was going on, and all the media criticism was. Assad was certainly dropping some bombs indiscriminately and killing some civilians, and it was a tragic situation, and Assad was committing crimes, but in what he believed a long-term benefit to kill the terrorists that were in the city. Eventually, I think in part because of the media criticism of East Aleppo and really pointing out the crimes that Assad was committing, as Assad cut a deal to allow the terrorists to go to the Idlib province and freed all the civilians who wanted to leave East Aleppo. Of course, this all happened right before Christmas. It was in December of last year. At the same time, the U.S. was invading East Mosul. And I was somewhat critical of the media because of their lack of coverage of East Mosul and the U.S. crimes there, which I thought were comparative to the Russian and Syrian crimes in East Aleppo. However, for the U.S. government to ignore the U.S. media to ignore the old city and what's going on in Mosul now, it's a direct direct comparison to East Aleppo. It's very clear. The old city of Mosul is very hard to navigate for like tanks and armored vehicles, so it's really just door-to-door fighting by Iraqi special forces fighters. ISIS members are dressing in burqas and going up and committing suicide bombings at checkpoints, or using the burqas to ambush Iraqi forces. Iraq has actually banned wearing burqas in Mosul. I don't know how that's going to go with the civilian population, or how even the civilian population may find out about this. I mean, it seems like it could be something that could just be missed. And some poor woman may get shot because she was unaware of the new laws or regulations for that area. And also to think that in Iraq and Mosul now, in 2017, that you could be shot for wearing a burqa seems insane, but that's where we are 16 years, or probably 14 years after Bush killed Saddam Hussein. And so, and honestly, and for these women, I mean, I know there's some places where the ISIS soldiers were requiring the women to wear the burqas and the full body scarf, and they may be put in a position where if you wear a burqa on one street, you could get killed, and if you don't wear it on the next street, you could get killed for that. And how you navigate and live a life like that is amazing to me. Though just those poor civilians having to try to navigate this in their lives is incredible. And so I think for the United States to try to take the Grand Mosque and the old city of Mosul, it's going to take some time. It's going to be bloody. It's going to be nasty. But yet there's not that same level of criticism. And I think that's really, really awful. I mean, if you're going to criticize people for stuff, at least be consistent when the facts are just this close to being aligned. I would say one difference is that the old city of Mosul, I think, holds more kind of spiritual significance for some fighters of ISIS, and so I think it could be even a more dangerous fight for that reason. I also think that there are more civilians right now in the old city of Mosul than were in the East Aleppo. I believe the number was in the tens of thousands for civilians in East Aleppo, and the number of civilians in the old city of Mosul is 200,000 right now, is the estimate. You also have to contend with the fact that I think it's impossible for the U.S. to cut the same deal with ISIS that Assad cut with the rebels there. Honestly, I don't know, how to ever judge the morality of making an agreement with Al-Qaeda where you send them all to a different area to grow and fester and oppress other people. However, you did avoid the slaughter of a lot of civilians in East Mosul, or in East Aleppo, by cutting that deal. And so for that kind of deal to not even be on the table for the United States is really sad. But like I said before, you have the maddest annihilation tactic going on in Iraq right now, and that seems to be the U.S. policy, is to kill them all. I also want to note that Turkey carried out airstrikes against the PKK in northern Iraq, killing 6 PKK fighters. These numbers are alleged by Turkey, of course. I believe this is the region kind of where the YPG will sometimes train with the PKK, and so it'll be interesting to see if Turkey's maybe killing off some U.S. allied fighters. In Yemen, I want to touch on the cholera outbreak. In the month of May, 500 Yemeni died from cholera. I listened to a very short interview with Claire Marina, who is the Doctors Without Borders director for Yemen. She really outlined and explained the cholera outbreak, what cholera is, how people die from cholera, how to prevent cholera from killing, what the future looks like for Yemen, and just kind of how bleak the situation is there. So when cholera is very spreadable, it's easy to stop the spread, soap, wash your hands, all that stuff, but a lot of those products aren't available to people in rural Yemen. And there may not be that knowledge of, bacterial disease and stuff to really understand how some of this is spread. When somebody contracts cholera, they don't show symptoms right away, and I think that also makes it easier for the disease to spread. Cholera kills people, basically dehydrating them by making them vomit and diarrhea until that happens. A couple saline pads will save somebody who has cholera. You just go to the hospital, get some fluids, and you go home and you're fine and dandy. However, a lot of people either don't have access to get to hospitals, don't have the funds to pay hospitals, or there isn't a medical facility in the area because it has since been bombed by either Saudi Arabia or maybe the Houthis have destroyed it in some way. With the cure being so easy and with the disease being so easy to spread, I guess it's just such a shame that there's a war going on there right now and people not being able to be saved from this very preventable disease. I know like so many Americans are so sad when somebody dies from a preventable disease in the U.S. Because they couldn't maybe afford the treatment. This seems to almost be worse because it's a situation where the people maybe can afford the treatment, they just can't have access to the treatment because the road had been bombed between their house and the hospital, or the local hospital had been destroyed. The UN has announced that the crisis in Yemen has come and that the crisis we've all been warning about is here. And I think that the cholera outbreak is kind of a good sign of that. The cholera outbreak shows that the Yemeni medical facilities are in complete shambles because people are dying because they're vomiting and diarrheaing too much, and that this is just so easy to solve, to give somebody an IV that you really don't even need to have any medical training at all to provide this cure to somebody, but the complete inability to get to a saline solution pack is causing people to die. There's also a lot of people starving in Yemen right now, and of course the woman, the Doctors Without Borders director, did say that if the port of Hadaya is taken, then that will cause a humanitarian crisis in North Yemen. Last thing I want to update on is the Philippines situation. 11 Philippine soldiers died in a friendly fire strike, and rebels are using stolen weapons and freed prisoners to aid in their fight against the Philippines government. That mess is still going on. I'm going to hope to update that more next week. Very interesting story with ISIS having an affiliation group there, taking a Philippine city and really holding it for over a week. I'm kind of surprised that they've lasted so long, but it seems like they are able to push back against the Durante government a little bit. Alright, that'll conclude my show for today. I hope you all liked the show. If you did like the show, please share the show, subscribe to the show on iTunes, and give me a rating and review there as well. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. I'm on Facebook at Kyle's Files, private Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus. Website is kylesfilesblog.com. Files is spelled Files. I'm also a blogger at the libertarianinstitute.org, so check that out. Thanks, everybody.